I'm Dr. Lori Burrows, and you're listening to Conversations, a podcast dedicated to raising awareness about antimicrobial resistance, otherwise known as AMR. AMR occurs when disease-causing microbes evolve to resist antibiotics and other similar medications, which is just about as bad as it sounds. That's why this episode proudly supports Antibiotic Awareness Week Canada in its mission to bring attention to these important issues. Welcome to the show. Today's guest is Andy Haigh, the President and CEO of Adapsyn Biosciences. This Hamilton-based chemical bioinformatics company is a world leader in the discovery and development of novel bacterial metabolites for use as therapeutics. Andy brings to us a wealth of perspective from the industry side of things, and we're so happy to have him join us on the show. Welcome, Andy. Let's start by talking about your work with Adapsyn and how it's helping to combat antimicrobial resistance in Canada.
Absolutely. And Lori, to start with, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you and to speak to your audience. So Adapsyn Bioscience was set up in 2016. It was spun out of McMaster University, primarily based on inbound interest from Pfizer in work that was going on in Dr. Nathan McGarvey's lab. And specifically what we do is take a what I'll call advanced computational approach to what's really a very old problem. And so we're focused on identifying a class of compounds called natural products. And so these are small molecules that are produced by bacteria that we take and co-opt as human therapeutics. And, notably, this type of research has been going on for decades. And so, the first generation or the first classes of antibiotics were all natural products, a lot of them discovered in the 50s and 60s. But this type of research has really kind of fallen out of favor over the past 20 years. And that's for a few reasons. I think on the one hand, it's because, the field essentially saw diminishing returns in that a lot of the same compounds were being isolated over and over again. And as a result of that, techniques like combinatorial chemistry and DNA-encoded libraries, really became quite popular. And I think that's unfortunate because, these types of compounds have had such a profound impact on the history of medicine, and in particular as the history of antibiotic development. And so what we really do is we apply kind of modern computational tools to data generated both from microbial genomes and from the metabolomes of those bacterial strains. And we can go in and we can identify novel drug-like metabolites that these bugs are producing in high throughput. And so that allows us to go in and we can actually isolate these compounds very quickly and start to assay them and figure out kind of what it is that they do and where they might be useful. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the company was set up in 2016, primarily based on inbound interest from Pfizer in work that we were doing. And, the work that we did with Pfizer was essentially to go in and profile an existing microbial strain library and help pick out novel drug-like compounds those bugs were producing, and we were certainly able to do that. In 2017, we raised a seed financing, and so Pfizer's venture capital group took part, plus a group in Toronto called Genesis Capital. And then since that time, we've been running off those funds. We have raised some money from Genome Canada to do some work in the microbiome, and generally that's been what's sustained the company. Our mandate, though, I will say, is not directed at discovering novel antibiotics per se. Typically when we go out and we speak to external folks, we're really kind of leaning on some of the immunosuppressive properties that historically some of these compounds have had. Natural products have had a profound impact in cardiovascular health as well. And so, we kind of look, and oncology also, and so we kind of look at a broad spectrum of indications or broad spectrum of disease as opposed to just focusing on antibiotic development. And that's in part due to some of the complexities around trying to fund discovery and development of new antibiotics.
Well, that is an excellent segue to my next question for you, which is, we all know that the market for antibiotics is broken, and it's kind of referred to as a market failure. So, how do you see industry and government working together to fix this problem?
The fundamental challenge around developing novel antibiotics is as follows. I mean, it's not like developing a new cancer drug where an incremental improvement over an additional approved treatment has the potential to net a company and its investors billions of dollars. The challenge is that if I develop a new antibiotic, it'll be used sparingly as to not promote antimicrobial resistance in the community. And so the company and our investors don't necessarily see the return that you would if I were developing compounds in other indications. And so, kind of how do we think about funding antibiotics in that context, or how do we kind of think about fixing that model? And I guess in my mind, it comes down to a few different things. I think number one, we do need to have meaningful support for early stage research and development, and not just in an academic setting. There's only really so far you can take a drug program on academic funding, and even there, the amount of money through granting agencies in this country isn't nearly going to be enough. And so, I do think that, there needs to be some form of non-dilutive type investment from government to help companies, both large and small, help tackle this problem. And I think, we have to be selective in what we fund, and we have to be willing to go big. And so what I mean by that is I would personally far rather see 2 projects funded to the tune of $15 million each, as opposed to 30 projects getting $1 million each, right? And I think the latter is, in a lot of cases, what Canada has done when it comes to some of this stuff. And I think that without that scale, we're not really going to see anything meaningful come out. And then I think on the back end, we also need to reconsider how we pay for new antibiotics. I think a new drug which has the potential to address a particular resistant bacterial strain or what have you, should be priced more like a drug for an orphan indication rather than an incremental improvement over an existing therapy. Because if the economics aren't there on the back end, I do think it's going to be really, really challenging to incent, kind of companies like ours or our investors to actually, kind of spend a meaningful amount of time trying to tackle this problem.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also a challenge for resistant bacteria in that it's difficult to do trials, right? Because usually the number of patients that are having issues with these types of bacteria is not huge right now, right? It's going to get worse, but it's not huge right now. So it can take a long time to accrue enough patients to even demonstrate non-inferiority of your new drug.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And look, I'll go a step further and say, there are some Canadian funding mechanisms out there that have the potential to address the challenge that you just mentioned. But in at least one instance that I know of, the group that was running the trial was ultimately unable to access Canadian government funding because the trial in its entirety wouldn't be conducted in Canada. And so, this is a funding agency that didn't want to see, and rightfully so, but didn't necessarily want to see Canadian taxpayer funds be invested in a clinical trial run outside of the country. But to the point that you just make, that type of restriction in this situation doesn't necessarily work because there is not a large enough patient population in this country to successfully run a completely homegrown phase 3 clinical trial for some of these bugs. Okay,
so when you look at what other jurisdictions are trying to do to fix this problem, so there's the Netflix model in the UK where they want hospitals to subscribe in advance. There's the sort of the Carbex model, which sort of a public public-private partnership that tries to push things along. What do you think we should look at in Canada to model after?
Yeah. So look, I think it's a great question. And I think from my purview, I'm generally a little more familiar with programs like if it's CARB-X or the Innovative Medicines Initiative in Europe or BARDA or GATES. As I look across these various different programs, I think a lot of them obviously have very specific guidelines in terms of development stage, clinical stage. In some cases, they're going after very specific target pathogens, for example, GATES and tuberculosis. But I think the one thing that they all have in common is that the investments they're making are meaningful. Notably, there was also recently this AMR Action Fund set up where a number of pharma companies contributed. And the goal there is to advance new medicines specifically through clinical trials. And again, the types of dollars that are being talked about are meaningful, and I think do have the potential to kind of result in new medicines. In terms of what Canada should do, I think there's a few different ways that we can contribute to tackling the problem. I don't necessarily know that a kind of Canada-like CARB-X program is really going to be the answer. And I say that because Canada's roughly a tenth of the size of the U.S. And there aren't necessarily going to be the same opportunity sets that fit into these kind of little boxes that one might ultimately go out and look for. And so I guess in my mind, we have a few different options available to us. I think on the one hand, it's relatively well known that CARB-X is now kind of looking to solicit contributions from places outside just the U.S., right? And so I think there's an opportunity for Canada to either contribute to this problem indirectly by helping to fund CARB-X. I think, perhaps what makes a little more sense is that whenever we see investment from IMI, CARB-X, GATES, AMR Action Fund, any of these, kind of types of groups that are serious about tackling this problem, that Canada essentially co-fund whatever that project might look like, and so essentially double up on that funding. I think, there is an opportunity for us to be able to contribute in that regard and directly kind of help the success of companies. And notably, we would be leveraging investment from outside of the country, which is something which I think the Canadian government certainly looks for.
Yeah, as a smaller country, our ability to put that kind of money into that problem is not there. Do you think one of the things that's kind of inspired me about the COVID pandemic, if a pandemic can be inspiring, is that there's been a massive effort to fund vaccine development by putting money in upfront for and not just to a single company or a couple companies, but a very broad swath of companies, kind of a bet hedging strategy. And that to me seems like the way to do this. And it shows that the will is there. Do you think that approach would work for AMR?
Yeah, so look, I think it would work for AMR more broadly. I think, if I've learned anything over the past, kind of, I want to say few years, but perhaps more than that, it's the business that we're in a lot of cases really does require global collaboration, and it requires you to work with external partners, either in Europe, either in the US, in Japan, or what have you. And so, I agree that a large targeted investment similar to what's been done globally around COVID has the potential to make a real impact. I commend Canada for what we've done investing in, kind of local companies that are looking to address this challenge. But I do think that, in some instances, kind of companies like Pfizer or like others are perhaps better addressed to put that capital to work, kind of early on. And so I think that, I wouldn't want us to be too, I think that in order to contribute to this problem, we need to make the decision to do it, but then not end up being overly dogmatic about how we go about it. And I guess, kind of what I mean by that is that often some of these government programs or, kind of funding supports end up being defined so narrowly that only really a handful of companies or groups would ever end up being eligible. And so I guess in my mind, I think we need to be willing to commit to the problem, but then be open to using our collective best judgment as to how to, kind of direct those funds and be somewhat indifferent to modality, development stage, or what have you, kind of going forward.
So you mentioned earlier that you guys are in the business of identifying natural products with not just antibiotic activity, but potentially anti-cancer activity, anti-immunosuppressive activity.
Yeah.
Do you think that antibiotics are undervalued compared to some of these other? I mean, it's the same natural products in a lot of cases, right? But people want to pay, pennies on the dollar for an antibiotic, whereas they're willing to pay a whole heck of a lot more for an immunosuppressant or an anti-cancer compound.
Yeah.
Do you think we charge too little for antibiotics?
Well, I mean, look, I think that I think the reality of it is that, a lot of these compounds and a lot of the compounds that are used in regular clinical practice are, they're old drugs. In a lot of cases, they're generic, and so they don't necessarily cost a lot of money in the first place. And again, I go back to one of my comments earlier, the notion of an incremental improvement over an existing generic drug isn't necessarily going to allow you to kind of command a lot. I guess in my mind, the extent to which people have looked at the notion of, kind of quality adjusted life years and the type of pricing that can go into this, because if you do have a resistant infection and, that ultimately leads to, kind of early and potentially unnecessary deaths, then, I got to believe that somewhere within that kind of pay for performance framework, there is something there that will suggest that, if you are able to treat only the trickiest of infections, for example, that we should be willing to pay. Now, again, I don't know, kind of what the research looks like around that, but I'm sure that, kind of people smarter than me have spent their time looking at it.
So solving AMR is obviously such a daunting task for people across the globe, but what are some things that give you hope or confidence that we'll eventually rise to the challenge?
The path for antibiotic development in general is fairly well worn. We know how to do it once we find a drug. The preclinical models exist and the endpoints are generally accepted. And I say this in comparison to some of these kind of newer modalities around, for example, CRISPR in a therapeutic setting where people aren't necessarily sure what the long-term effects are going to be. And so, I think people are proceeding with caution there. And I think, on the other side of it, the kind of the discovery path here is relatively well known as well. And so, and again, I'm going to plug natural products for a second, but of the 26 known antibiotic classes, 21 of them are natural products, only 5 discovered entirely through synthetic chemistry efforts. And we also know that synthetic chemistry, I guess because of that, we know that synthetic chemistry isn't great at finding novel antibiotics. And so, you can kind of start looking back to the type of work that we are doing and certainly others are doing. And so, yes, it's an old process for discovery and a fairly well-worn path for development. And what we're doing and what others are doing is really applying, kind of modern computational tools to that really, really old process, right? And so in doing so, we're able to go in and we're able to pick out novel chemistry very, very quickly. There are other groups that are working on things like heterologous gene expression, where you can take the gene clusters of the genetic machinery that ultimately make these compounds and put them into a common host. And again, with the hope of being able to pull out chemistry that much more quickly. I think once you've got that, there are now groups that are doing high content screening, i.e. using imaging to be able to figure out very quickly what pathways you're hitting and whether or not the type of chemistry that you're isolating has the effect that you want to. And so, all that is to say, we know these compounds have had a profound impact, and we now know, or we've been, as a field, there's a lot more technology that ultimately goes into or is being applied in service of pulling these things out. And I think that once you have a novel compound and you have a interesting or kind of mechanism that you ultimately want to target, the path beyond there becomes, as I've heard it described, essentially block and tackle, right? Like, yes, you will have to optimize that molecule. You'll have to put it through its paces, and you'll have to do your preclinical studies and your IND enabling studies or Health Canada enabling studies. But people generally know what that looks like. And so, I guess for me, the hope is that we can now bring technology to bear on this problem in a way that we haven't done so in the past. And again, not just Adapsyn, but I think as the community as a whole.
So I have one last question for you, and that's, we're living in weird times, as you know, and the upside is people have never been more aware of infectious diseases on a daily basis than they ever have. How has the pandemic affected your business, and what has it changed for you, and what kind of doors do you think it will open for you?
I think COVID-19 has certainly shed light on kind of the potential impact of infectious disease, and I'd also kind of on a hopeful note, I think it's also shown the capacity of the scientific community to ultimately address these challenges when we need to, right?
Mm-hmm.
Remember, this is a virus that didn't really exist in a human context a year ago. Kind of 11 months later, 10 months later, Pfizer's announced that their vaccine candidate's 90% effective. And so, of course, there's a lot more work to do, but it's pretty remarkable what the scientific community has been able to accomplish in a very short period of time. Now, obviously the impact of COVID-19 has been devastating, but my obvious hope is that this prompts policymakers to be more proactive about solving these types of problems rather than reactive in the face of AMR. And I do think that we're starting to see some signs of that, which is really encouraging.
Hopefully they'll have some money left over to be proactive about the next.
Yeah, well, apparently they do. Apparently they do, so that's good.
Well, Andy, thanks for chatting with us today, and keep up the good work at Adapsyn.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.